is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with author Matthew Wilson about his new book, The Hidden Language of Symbols. In the conversation, we touch on just a handful of the dozens of symbols and hidden meanings collected from the art and architecture of societies from around the world and profiled in his book. And now, a conversation about secrets hiding in plain sight with author Matthew Wilson. Matthew Wilson, thank you for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Matthew, you have written a book, The Hidden Language of Symbols. Can you kind of give us an overview of your book?
Yeah, sure. Yes. I mean, it is what it kind of sounds like, really. It's a compilation of some of the, what I kind of believe are the most impactful symbols in art history. I've previously written a book on the same subject before. And yeah, just like, I don't know, I think the kind of whole thing kind of really started out a little on one level, just from looking at lots and lots of pictures in art history and just kind of thinking about which symbols are the ones that occur the most, and which ones have got the most interesting story to tell. And that's essentially what the book is. It's a selection of different stories of different either objects or artifacts or plants or animals that occur in paintings and artworks, and even in kind of architectural decoration as well, that have got a specific meaning behind them, and also the ones that seem to have an extraordinary story to tell through history. Because what I look at is the kind of evolution of symbols, how they started out, where they started out from, how they've developed. So each chapter that I tell is like almost like a little biography of a symbol through history. And that's basically what the book is.
Well, my experience is that understanding the context of when a work was made, along with this language of symbolism, as you put it, really kind of brings artwork to life for the viewer.
Definitely. I mean, my job for the past 15 years is a teacher of art history. Not in a university, but in American terms, in a high school. So I teach at, in the UK, we call it sixth form level, which is the kind of period of teaching between kind of being a school student and being someone who goes off to university. And as an educator, I think that's a really remarkable time to be teaching young people, because it's a kind of pivotal in their learning of going from being having a kind of juvenile understanding of learning and the world, and then migrating into a kind of more deep university style of learning. So it's a really wonderful period in a student's life to be teaching them. And I've kind of found that something that really triggers everyone's imagination is where, like exactly as you said, you have an image, we look at an image in class, and there are things in that image that seem to have a cryptic meaning that they cannot access because they're learning about art, and that maybe other people who drift through a museum or gallery wouldn't be able to access. And that kind of idea that you can like look at an artwork and actually kind of pull meaning from these symbols. And then I guess the added interest as well in that some of these symbols have got quite complicated meanings. The artists can be very sophisticated in the way that they deploy them to kind of draw you into the kind of puzzle or the detective work into learning what symbols or artifacts mean. So essentially, I think you're absolutely right. And that's one of the main triggers for writing the book, was just thinking, well, my students really seem to love that exploration and that way into looking at an artwork. But also their sort of attitude towards examining them was inspirational to me in return, because they would ask very basic questions about things. We would have a look at a painting that would contain a peacock, and an art historian might tell them that a peacock represents the resurrection of Christ, and I might tell them that as a fact, a straight up fact. But the simple question why then triggers a huge amount of interesting answers to it. Where did that start? Who was the first person to come up? What did a single person come up with that? And then if so, why? Why not another animal? And by answering those questions, you can actually take footsteps back into the past and recover like a detective story about where that came from. And in the process, you learn not only about art, but also about the history of humanity. So what a kind of extraordinary and exceptional way to actually access the history of humanity than by going through that process.
I think the other thing that I find also kind of unlocks a rich experience for those students, because I've taught art history in the past also, is just the revelation that there is a collective meaning for these symbols. I guess in your book you refer to Jung referring to it as the collective unconscious. Like, we see that these symbols are adopted worldwide in times and places where there's no reason people should have been gathering the same meanings for these symbols. But then we also see symbols migrate and adapt across cultures, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so the initial instigation was kind of seeing the kind of interest, I guess, in the students I teach. But very quickly, exactly right, I began to kind of realize that actually this study of symbols is actually a wonderful arena in which to engage lots of different artworks in the same space. So my experience, I don't know if this is the same as your experience of museums or even learning in a wider sense, is that everything's very compartmentalized. You go into a museum or a big gallery and you've got your Africa section and your Asia section, your Europe section. And even in school curriculums, we segregate subjects. So science is disaggregated from art, and geography is very distinct from maths. But that's not really how I naturally see things, or not how I want to see things. I want to see things holistically and how they interact, how systems connect with one another. And I just don't believe that maths is a different subject to science. Math is a different subject to, say, art, or that you can separate science from all the other subjects in the curriculum. And the same with art as well. And I think one of the things that I kind of has always fascinated me, and I wanted to use my study of symbols to engage with, is how do you find a place, a platform, or an arena to show all of these different artworks from different parts of the world interacting with one another? So in the book, there is an awful lot of transnational contact between things, and that's really what it becomes, is a study of the contact between cultures. And just coming back to your question, when you're saying, how there's a kind of collective understanding of things around us. So there's some kind of incredible things that I discovered in the chapters that I talk about, like the idea of, when I was writing about dragons, is that you see the presence of dragons in cultures that demonstrably have had no contact with one another. And yet the thing that they come up with is a very, very similar type of beast with scales, that breathes fire, that inhabits water. Why? How did that happen? Or you look at a subject like mirrors. So one of my chapters is on the idea of the mirror, and Celtic cultures buried people with mirrors, and you see the same thing happening in Japan and in China. People think that mirrors are a portal to a mystical other world, and you see that in Mesoamerican culture, and you see it in European and Asian cultures as well. Another one of my chapters is about foxes, and I discuss really three artworks with foxes in them. One from London that's from the 14th century, one from Peru that was made in the 5th century, and another one that was made in Tokyo in the 19th century. And in all three examples, you've got foxes that have put on human clothing and have been a sort of trickster amongst a kind of the world of humanity. And with those three distinct places, that they wouldn't have had any contact with one. They wouldn't have known that there wouldn't be a shared mythology. But for some reason, they've all arrived at the same point of having clothed foxes, kind of pulling tricks on people. So and it's just everyone's going to be fascinated by that, aren't they? I mean, why do these coincidences exist? Is it because as a human species, we've just got sort of similar attitudes towards things? Or I don't know, with lots of things that involve animals, for example, it's just animals have got these characteristics that we respond to, and that could lead to a kind of common set of attributes that we put on these animals. So there is that kind of interesting kind of element to investigate. But then the other thing that you said was the way that they mutate and adapt and change through time, which is, of course, the other interesting thing that we can look at. And a lot of the symbols that I deal with are actually, they've been sort of transacted across the globe because of the contact that's been made with either invading armies or growing empires, or trading networks that then sort of suddenly kind of connect one disparate side of the world to another. So, like another example, I've got a chapter on sunflowers. It's quite interesting actually. I got into sunflowers. I guess probably everyone kind of thinks of Van Gogh, don't they? It's kind of the kind of king of the sunflower. Trying to like delve into like what's Van Gogh saying through his sunflowers. He's got some message that he's obviously obsessed with them, and he thought symbolically. He was a great art historian, and is, I think mentally Van Gogh. What do they mean to him? So very initially, I mean, years ago, I was kind of thinking, well, I'll have a look at some other sunflower icons in art history, and I suddenly realized I couldn't find a single one from classical times. And no sunflowers don't exist in classical history, and anywhere really in the whole of Eurasia until the end of the 16th century. And that's because sunflowers are not a European species; they come from Central South America. So the only way they came into this orbit was by the kind of imperial kind of Spain kind of coming in, colonizing, and then taking artifacts back to Europe. And then the way that Europe then reacted to this incredible looking sort of gargantuan flower with its flaming kind of corona of petals, it kind of quickly got kind of adopted into the culture and then gained its own symbolic language, its own symbolic life. And then, and then had its kind of own kind of remarkable history. But that only happened because of the spread of empires. And that's just one example of how you start off with like something very, sort of almost like kind of very simple or kind of obvious, like a sunflower. And it sort of leads you into this kind of quite epic history of the world.
That whole migration and adaptation reminds me of just how interesting my study of the Silk Road has been in terms of just how even materials and colors migrated from the Middle East to China, and materials and technology for ceramics migrating back to the Middle East. And there winds up being what we think of today as being very prototypical things from particular areas, really a result of this migration and adaptation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think that the chapter that I wrote on halos is the one that engages with the Silk Roads the most, which is, and again, it's another kind of one where it's quite kind of fascinating to have a look at, or to ask yourself the question, okay, so Jesus has got a halo, but you've also got, Hindu deities that have got halos, Buddha's got a halo. And you also see halos in kind of Mithraic religions as well. And you kind of go, well, why is that? And there's a kind of particular point in history where suddenly all these guys, they didn't have them before, and suddenly they all have them. So you got to go, okay, so the halo, so what's that about? Let's kind of trace ourselves right back to probably its origins in Mithraic religions. And then bit by bit, you can see how kind of coins that are stamped with Mithraic deities with a circular disc halo behind them are then traded into India. And then, whereas previously the Buddha does not have any kind of iconic representation, he's not represented in art at all. It's all done through symbols previously. But as soon as he's given this, very quickly afterwards, he's given this halo to kind of link into what they understand probably as a neighboring religion. And then meanwhile, and then it kind of gets spread eastwards through these, like you're saying, like through the kind of Silk Road connections, particularly because Buddhist monasteries become the sort of stopping points along that route. So you can kind of almost kind of track this kind of motif kind of going through, and then bit by bit, suddenly it appears in China, and then it appears in the rest of Southeast Asia, in Japan, and meanwhile it's kind of going the other way. It's going into the Roman Empire as well. So there's kind of Roman deities that begin to have a solar disc, and then emperors start to have it, and then when Christianity appears in the Roman Empire, in order to look like an important figure, he's got to look like a Roman emperor, and that's why he suddenly has a halo behind him as well. So it's just all of these things. I don't know, I just find them so fascinating, but also there's something just kind of deeply enriching about this idea that there's a lot of connection going on, and like I said at the start of our conversation, that notion of connection is much more interesting to me than compartmentalization. Seeing how, as a human species, we're not distinct. There are things that we definitely kind of share with each other, and that for me is like a very enriching way to study culture.
Well, it just seems like there's a bottomless pit of symbols that you could have covered in. I feel like this could be a work in multiple volumes, but you pared it down into sort of 4 silos. Can you kind of describe how you wound up dividing these into, sections that are a little bit more manageable?
Yeah, sure. It's not easy, is it? I mean, okay, first of all, you're absolutely right. This is a kind of potentially a sort of bottomless pit of absolutely fascinating things to look at. And yes, I had to pare it down, and I've done actually quite sort of short chapters on each one because I wanted to. So I think you can kind of go on endlessly on them, and actually certain ones of them I think could be a kind of book in their own right, really, because the story they have to tell is so fascinating. But I think from the very start, I kind of wanted to write a book, ideally that would sort of inspire other people to trigger an interest in something that has got a much bigger story. But I'll just provide like the tip of the iceberg on the story. So the organization of it. So I mean, quickly it became apparent that like a lot of the symbols that I was dealing with are what they are is a kind of what they were trying to be was a transnational language to unite people. So, for example, when you get religious symbols, religions and empires have got to like unify people from lots of disparate geographical regions, and also people who speak in different languages. And otherwise, people got very little kind of connection with one another. But an empire or a religion needs to somehow unify them. And that's where one of the great uses of symbols historically is to kind of give people that sense of some kind of community sense in a language that is not kind of specific linguistically to one place. So it kind of seemed kind of pretty obvious, therefore, that I'd have a chapter, for example, on religious symbols that would like with a halo, or with there's motifs like the dove, for example, or the lotus flower, which has got an incredible history in its own right, and how they where they appear and how they've got there, and so which people are orchestrating this kind of the dissemination of these symbols. Now, I mean, I'm writing from the point of view of someone who was brought up in the UK and studied probably quite a traditional art history syllabus when I was at university. So my sort of starting point is obviously from my own perspective, which is like a kind of Western Christian tradition. But also with a great interest in understanding how different religions have communicated and whether they're similar or whether they're different. And actually, coming back to our conversation about the Silk Roads, you very quickly see how a kind of Christian culture might think of itself as being quite distinct, but an awful lot of distinct maybe from the rest of the world or unique in some way. But very quickly you look at it and kind of realize that there's nothing unique or distinct or segregated. We're connected. Within the visual culture of Christianity, we are connected to the rest of the world and into disparate parts of the world through history. So it's kind of became clear from a start that kind of idea of religion and how religions have dealt with symbols was going to form a core part of the book. So that became section number 2, which is called The Hidden Language of Faith. The first chapter is called The Hidden Language of Power, which is kind of about the empire side of things. So that is, I don't know, like the key motifs I've picked up in that are things like eagles. So, sort of saying that one of the things I said in that chapter is kind of, as we speak, there's an eagle on the floor of the Oval Office in the White House. But you also see eagles connected to like so many great empires. Where does that come from? And tracing it kind of right back, it's the Romans really that are the ones who they have got the eagle, and that is that the Roman Empire has this big impact on all subsequent empires. So the eagle becomes this like very key motif for empires. But there are other kind of really interesting symbols like sort of lions and horses and falcons, where when you see them in artworks, they've got their own message to tell about power and authority and sort of political dominance over regions, using powerful animals or motifs that connect ourselves to imperial conquest or colonialization. So that was that. So we've got the hidden language of power is the first section, hidden language of faith is the second. And then with the next two, I was kind of, there are lots of symbols that you see in more in kind of an art and a kind of creative context. So we've got the hidden language of uncertainty, which is where I collated together all of the symbols that have got kind of slightly negative connotations or that talk about difficult things, so death or ostracization of people, the sinister, the occult. So I've got a chapter there on the swastika, for example, which in its own right is a very interesting symbol. Maybe we'll come back to it as a topic of conversation slightly later, but part of the power of symbols, I've picked symbols that sort of demonstrate how powerful symbols can be. So, for example, the swastika is one of those things that kind of demonstrates that a symbol can be taken from an original context, manipulated into something else, and it's become something that's almost too unpalatable even to look at in the modern age. And there are other examples I've got in my book as well. And then the last section, I wanted to end on something more hopeful. So that's why that's called the hidden language of hope, which is where I've kind of done the opposite and extracted out symbols that actually have got some kind of sense of positivity to offer, that talk about the sort of regeneration, life, love, connection, wealth, optimism. Yeah. So that's how I've kind of sectioned them out. There probably could have been a million different ways that I could have organized all those symbols, but that seemed to be the most kind of convenient way to do it. And it also allows us to kind of end on a positive note, because I've finished with hope.
Sometimes the meaning that's associated with a particular symbol has a tendency to change over time. And, for example, I thought it was really interesting. You had a whole chapter on owls. The attributes that we assign to owls today is much different than what have been attributed to owls for millennia. And, how did that even change? Like, at what point were these attributes turned on their head?
Yeah. So funny enough, so owls is, that's another kind of aspect of the book as a whole, I think, is that with the subject of symbols, you can, they're obviously like exclusive to art history, because I'm thinking, particularly from my point of view, of going around a gallery and seeing the types of things I'm writing about appearing in artworks, and like I said before, even in architectural decoration. But the great thing is they also cut across to popular culture, because within the book I talk about, so for example, with owls, I kind of bring in the idea that you see a Disney film, and often owls are these kind of like wise, or Harry Potter or whatever. Owls are these kind of wise animals. So, and again, like I mentioned in a section on the scythe of death, so the Grim Reaper's scythe, that you kind of see that in paintings by Bruegel, but you also see it in Bill and Ted's Bogus Adventure. So it's one of these things that kind of crosses over into popular culture, as well as in I don't know, gallery, museum, high culture, as it's known. Yeah, so I think this is kind of like I guess preconception that an owl is a wise animal. That's how I was brought up. The owl with the kind of spectacles on, like a scholar. So I started off, okay, let's talk about the wisdom of owls, and then didn't really go very far, because most of the research I got to do was about how dreadful owls were in all kinds of contexts previous to the 20th century. So you've got owls, and there's this kind of wonderful artwork called the Burney Relief in the British Museum, which has got a kind of a sinister female goddess who's probably Ishtar or Lilith, or one of these Mesopotamian goddesses, flanked by two owls. They're supposed to be kind of like, I guess, beasts of the nighttime. They're kind of dark, they're eerie, and their hoot was quite sort of funereal, so they're kind of associated with the sinister. So you've got that association. Then you've got these kind of Roman writers who also talk about how ignorant and grotesque owls are. And then it gets really kind of nasty into the medieval period, in the early modern period, where owls are kind of associated with dirt and disease, and sometimes in printed graphic culture of the 17th century, they're actually connected in a racist way to marginalized communities, to express the fact that they are unwanted within the community, that they're dirty and they're impure. So that's kind of all kind of kind of quite interesting stuff. I mean, so this is the sinister owl. So the owl is kind of connected again to like witches and witchcraft, and it's only with a connection that we have through classical history that kind of redeems the owl and makes it into something that's praiseworthy and intelligent. Now, as a kind of holistic thing, the whole book, a lot of the time, I come back to the influence of the classical world because a lot of our symbols actually come from ancient Greece and Rome. That's one of the main well springs of a lot of symbolism. And I guess that's why it's kind of all art historians have kind of got to have a good bedding in the classics and in kind of ancient Greek art and Roman art. And in obviously in lots of ways, those cultures have impacted the modern world in terms of the education and law and everything else. And it's really with this idea that Athena, as the patron deity of Athens, is connected with an owl. And on coins that were minted in Athens, there would be an owl on the reverse of them. So that's another kind of spread of how symbols are kind of spread throughout the globe on currency. And with Athena being the goddess of wisdom, that owl then that's where the kind of connection comes in. So, and it's kind of, I guess, the responsibility of the Renaissance. So the Renaissance, where you have the rebirth of these classical ideas that are then revivified into culture. It's because of the Renaissance that the idea of the owl connected to Athena is then given that identity, and it becomes a wise figure. And in the end, I kind of close that chapter with this kind of idea. Now, I've just said that how important the classical world is to the modern age, but the kind of the culture that we kind of really think of is Athenian culture, which is and a kind of really quite a sort of short period of development in terms of democracy and culture and science. And that a lot of these ideas are actually coming from a tiny little city-state in the middle of the Mediterranean in a very specific period of time, but they have shaped so much, including the fact that when we watch a Disney movie, we expect an owl to be a wise bird, but not always wise, and sometimes actually completely the opposite of wise if you look back into our history.
When I was reading your chapter about the scythe, it reminded me of a story I had seen, this depiction of Moses in Rome in a number of places where Moses had horns. It was really curious, why would they choose to depict Moses with horns that in our day and age are so closely tied to the devil? The explanation was that in this particular text, Moses has an interaction with God, and when he comes down off the mountain, his face is glowing. But when you translate it, the word for the face being a glow, and it's really closely could be misinterpreted for this word as, having horns. And, all of a sudden, there winds up being official depictions in the church of Moses with horns when it was really talking about his face glowing. And it had me thinking about, how it is that Father Time wound up getting a scythe, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's such an interesting mistake, I suppose, of history, isn't it? And the idea of Father Time holding a scythe it's an art historical mix-up, a bit like the idea of Moses having horns. It's to do with mistranslation. Kronos was the patron deity of agriculture back in ancient Greek theology. Being the patron deity of agriculture, he then therefore has I think it's a sickle that he has. But then in ancient Rome, that name Kronos became kind of crossed or kind of mixed with the idea of chronos as in chronology, to do with time. So therefore, the kind of the overseer of time got a scythe or a sickle. And I suppose you could then kind of retrofit it and kind of go, well, it kind of makes sense, I suppose, because in harvest we we scythe crops, and therefore that kind of maybe links to the changing cycle of the seasons or whatever. But yeah, it's a bit of a mix up actually. So that's Father Time, and then you get the Grim Reaper figure, who's a slightly sort of different kind of character. Again, it's got a kind of an interesting story behind it, because the scythe is a instrument of agriculture. It's really became popular in Europe in the medieval period, And I kind of had this idea that probably the reason why the Grim Reaper has a scythe is probably because um, that was a weapon that was used in the peasant revolts. As poor people couldn't, they would attack with whatever they had in their around them, sort of agricultural implements. So to people of the time, the scythe would actually be a kind of a symbol of an upturning of the social order, of chaos, of the social system falling apart. In other words, of kind of ultimate horror. So therefore, it kind of makes sense that the personification of death should have that instrument rather than any other. So it's kind of quite interesting. And like I was saying earlier, there's an amazing picture I've got in the book, a Winslow Homer figure who's reaping crops. That is kind of alludes to the Civil War. But you also get kind of the Grim Reaper popping up in film what's that film?
Is it the Seventh Seal or
That's the one. Yeah, Seventh Seal. Yeah, my memory gave out just then. Who directed that? Bergman.
Bergman. He was playing chess with the Grim Reaper, I believe.
Yeah. So, and isn't that interesting? And so that again, I mean, he was, and the scenes in that film, actually, I haven't watched it for ages, but there are scenes in that film where he actually kind of kind of almost like brings medieval artworks to life, where he has these kind of like figures in a line, probably like a re-evocation of the dance macabre, the dance of death scenes. And again, that's where you get the kind of symbolism being projected into the present and into the future, isn't it? That artists or film directors will go back into art history, and it's just like this trove, this kind of treasure trove of illusions and motifs that then can be reused in artworks. They've got a kind of, there's the other kind of attraction for me as well, is they've got not only this kind of it's kind of a kind of interesting visual quality in the way that you read them, but they've got a sort of they've got a depth in history that that kind of gives them a sort of an enrichment that that just kind of fascinates me.
And sometimes I wonder just how much we're missing that would have been common knowledge or just understood in the time and context that work was made. And I had a guest on a couple of months back who had drawn some inspiration from the character Ophelia in Hamlet. In Ophelia, there's a scene where it really seems like she's going crazy as she's tossing these flowers, but each one of these flowers has a particular symbol. And I know that you touch on several different flowers in the language of hope. But each one of those flowers had a particular meaning that would have been understood by that audience, right? She was actually not just kind of going crazy tossing flowers. She was, actually making very pointed accusations to this family, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then that happens as well in the Victorian periods, where there are publications of books called The Language of Flowers, where the meanings of particular flowers are actually enumerated within the book. And then the whole kind of fad of people kind of, in essence, kind of sending coded messages to one another in bouquets of flowers. So I suppose that, that kind of knowledge is one that's kind of slightly lost, isn't it, in the modern age? And, when I was at university studying art history, and I think for anyone who's studied art history probably from the 80s onwards, is that what you study is kind of mostly, it's like art, like theoretical, and I didn't learn any of these kind of nuts and bolts things about art history, which is probably why I'm kind of fascinated with them now. And the heyday of studying symbols, that kind of study of iconography, was kind of probably in the sort of 40s and 50s, particularly in the UK, where you had the emigration of lots of incredible art historians from the German-speaking world who moved to London, and they bring this kind of the discipline of studying iconography to the UK, and it spawns a kind of generation of people who are very interested in that subject. And all the great, for me, the kind of great investigations into the history of symbolism comes from that period. But of course, the subject evolves and adapts and changes, doesn't it? So my education in art history probably lacked some of that sort of that stuff, which is why when after sort of a few years after leaving university, I suddenly became very fascinated by it.
And so let me ask you this: in terms of, I know that the majority of this is looking back, but and so I don't know if you have an opinion on contemporary art, but what is your opinion on the state of symbolism in contemporary art? Do we still see the same amount of symbolism, or are they just different symbols, and are they constantly changing?
Well, I do pick up on quite a few. I've tried as hard as I could to bring in contemporary artists into my book, and there are, I've got like quite a few artists I've tried to use. So there's a sculpture that Cara Walker made for the Tate Gallery in London, which is one of the kind of like the second image within the book. And I think you can look at her art, and actually they're quite rich in symbolism, and you can definitely read them that kind of way. The sculpture is a kind of big monumental, it's a big sculpture, like it's a fountain, in fact. With these kind of allegorical figures around it. It kind of looks quite Baroque, and I think that's kind of like the whole point of it. And it's quite a sort of tragic statement on the transatlantic slave trade, but using this kind of like language, which he's kind of using it. And I guess it's in a way of that this kind of symbolic language belongs to a kind of colonial past, and that's why the thing has resonance to it. But there are several artists that I try and use as well. I mean, I've mentioned Ai Weiwei, for example, in one of my chapters to do with sunflowers. But there are a few. I'm to be honest, I'm not sort of the world's greatest expert on contemporary art. But the one thing I would say is that I think, kind of having written this, and I tried to make this clear in even my sort of introduction to the book, is that the history of symbols is, if artists are out there not using the language of symbols or haven't sort of explored this as an interesting topic, I'd really urge them to do it, because it's such a kind of, there's so much there, and I think they'll inspire so many ideas. I mean, even to the point where I sort of, like I said before, I talk about the representation of a lot of animals and plants. If you sit down and kind of like draw or try and represent in an artwork a particular flower, like a lily or a carnation or a sunflower, there's obviously the kind of discipline of sort of witnessing it and being able to represent it. But the other dimension, which is how other human beings have represented it, what they've thought about it, as soon as that begins to filter into your creative output, I just think it gives it a kind of real resonance and depth. So yeah, I'd say, if as an artist, perhaps if you're missing a trick if you're not kind of looking in or kind of engaging with that kind of the history of symbolism.
Well, Matthew, I really appreciate your time today. I really enjoyed the book, and I think one of the things I really enjoyed, just from a practical standpoint, I mean, it really seems like a great resource for the person that teaches art history, but it's very approachable, the way you've broken it down into these bite-sized chunks and fully illustrated. I feel like anybody could pick it up and really find something in there for themselves. And so the book is available now?
It is indeed. Yeah, it should be out there in all good bookshops. Yeah.
Well, again, I appreciate you taking time to talk to me, and I hope everybody picks up a copy. I know that certainly for the folks that teach art history and are trying to kind of open up a window for young minds, I think it's a great starting point for a lot of really interesting discussions.
That's very kind of you to say, and thank you very much. I've really enjoyed that chat.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to Cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.